biologist with the Smithsonian, and I study, my interests are in diversity of natural ecosystems. And when I say diversity, I usually mean species diversity, although the concept to other people can be taken to mean genetic diversity, so individuals are different from one another, where diversity means differences among entities of some sort. So genetic diversity would mean a degree of genetic differences among individuals within a species, and then other kinds of diversity could be at higher levels, different kinds of organisms at a broader scale, like invertebrates and insects versus vertebrates and plants. But I usually study species diversity, and that meaning biodiversity means the number of species. So high biodiversity means many species, and low biodiversity means few species. And my area of study is in ways of counting how many species there are and where those species are located. And part of two concepts of diversity that are used in definitions are there's a word alpha diversity, and that means the number of species in one location. So to a biologist working in the forest like me, that usually means one small forest, less than a kilometer across, how many species are there. That's homogeneous terrain, and a bunch of species are growing together in exactly the same conditions. A different kind of diversity is beta diversity, and this is the number of species or the differences in species between two different places. And so most obviously in the tropics and anywhere in Europe or North America too, the species in mountains and dry areas are very different from the species in wet areas. So one encounters more diversity in areas that are more heterogeneous in climate and geology or elevation. So an important kind of diversity is there because some species grow in one area and other species grow in a different area. So that's a very different situation because then the species aren't growing together. They have different adaptations to grow in different places. And both those kinds of diversity are very interesting to me and sort of the balance between them. And so one can think of places in the world where there's a great deal of beta diversity, meaning high variation between locations, but each site has only a few species. And that's true in California example. California is very mountainous and very wet and near the coast and very dry inland, and so there's entirely different kinds of vegetation and different species. But at any one site, the alpha diversity isn't very high at all. There's only a small number of tree species growing together. In contrast, Amazonia is exactly the opposite. Amazonia is relatively homogeneous, it's flat, there's no mountains, and it rains a lot. And from site to site, the species are in fact fairly similar. Many species occur across Amazonia. On the other hand, so that's called low beta diversity. Different sites have similar species. But at any one site in Amazonia, there's a very large number of species. So there's an exact opposite there. There's a lot of species in Amazonia, but most of them are found you don't have to go very far to find a lot of species. But if I were in California, I have to travel all around to find a lot of species because they grow in different places. So that's something I spend a lot of time studying. And, Colombia, if I were to, as a country, Colombia is remarkably heterogeneous. It has among the highest mountains in the Americas. It has really dry deserts, and it has wet rainforest. And plus, it has this Amazonian forest where the alpha diversity is very high. So Colombia is a remarkable place biologically. It has all this kind of diversity. In the mountains, there can be great differences from one place to another in the kinds of species. Nearby valleys, one side of the mountain range to the other. And then mix that with an Amazonian forest, which is a big, I kind of think of Amazonia as one giant plain, one giant flatland, which is very similar in where species are similar, but there's many, many, many species. Well, that's an interesting one. It's a hard question to answer, and I think as a scientist, I have to say I'm not sure What could happen in the future? And interesting observations in the past is that the past has been a lot warmer than it is now, and it's been a lot colder than it is now. And during those phases, there's been a lot of different species, and many species have survived long periods of warm and survived long periods of cold. So I think, for me, I'm not quite sure what the future could bring. If it gets extremely dry, that's likely to cause extinction in Amazonia because it's a wet area. But if it gets extremely wet or wetter, then that's not likely to cause much extinction. But I think a lot right now is the predictions are very uncertain. And kind of a scientist where I'm trying to be careful and be sure what I say. I don't really know what's going to happen in the future. The way I would see it is, that depends on the services. So some of the services are carbon or just things that the forest provides, and that with lower diversity could be provided within a certain degree. But aspects like different kinds of food, or there are features that the forest might provide that require diversity. So there are many different kind of food crops we heard about in the lecture today, and different chemicals that might be used or harvested from the environment. The way I would see it is that the sort of changes that happen in Amazonia have to do with removing the forest. And when the forest is removed, many of the services are no longer provided. There's no longer food for people. The carbon is released into the atmosphere. And at that point, obviously, the diversity is gone. But it's not, a scenario where the question of diversity would be relevant is if somehow the forest was maintained, but with a lot fewer species. And I can't see that happening. I mean, if the forest is maintained, there will be a lot of species there. But the big changes have to do with removing the forest, and then there's no more forest. And it's not really the loss of species that has the impact, it's the loss of the forest.